In the brutal theater of corporate dominance, the loudest voice usually belongs strictly to the absolute weakest mind in the room. Society conditions the masses to fear the roaring predator, but the true danger never announces itself. It simply waits for the prey to expose itself. Watch the pathetic display of verbal desperation. Fists slamming against mahogany, a physical manifestation of insecurity trying to mask the paralyzing terror within. The noise is nothing but a fragile psychological shield. They project aggressive dominance, hoping the volume blinds everyone to the crippling doubt bleeding from their frantic gestures. An empty vessel always echoes the absolute loudest. Look closer at the chaotic hand movements. They are just frantically swatting at invisible threats born from their own profound inadequacy. Every unnecessary syllable strips away their remaining leverage. The over-explainer drowns in their own verbal flood, while the predator remains completely submerged in the crushing gravity of absolute stillness. True psychological power does not beg for anyone's attention. It anchors the space entirely, pulling the panicked energy directly toward a chilling singularity of calculated silence. A perfectly tailored dark silhouette wrapped in impenetrable shadows. Fingers steepled in a flawless geometric triangle, an architectural monument to control built upon. The fragile ruins of the opponent's shattering confidence. The psychological trap is meticulously set. Notice the frantic hands of the talker. They are sweating and swatting at invisible threats constructed purely by their own fragile ego. Watch the collar of their shirt suddenly become a suffocating noose. Their breathing accelerates into a shallow, desperate rhythm, an unmistakable biological signal of a prey animal realizing it is trapped. They over-explain every single detail, vomiting useless information onto the table, hoping that sheer volume will somehow build a barricade against the incoming judgment. But true psychological analysts do not listen to the words. We dissect the physical leakage, the nervous foot-tapping beneath the table that betrays the confident mask they attempt to wear. The dilated pupils searching aggressively for a lifeline. Every micro-movement screams a silent, pathetic plea, begging the room for just 1 ounce of external validation to survive. But the predator offers absolutely nothing. No nods of agreement, no comforting smiles, just a chilling blank stare that reflects their insecurities back into their own mind. The talker is fighting a ghost, expanding massive amounts of cognitive energy, while the silent observer merely sits and lets them completely exhaust their psychological reserves. A self-inflicted mental execution. The real game hasn't even begun. True power never announces its arrival. It simply sits and waits to be completely acknowledged by the desperate room. The human mind is naturally programmed to constantly seek patterns and respond to any sudden shift in the environment. But what happens when the stimulus is entirely removed and replaced exclusively by an absolute, unyielding, and terrifying void? The absence of sound becomes deafening. It is a deliberate psychological weapon, designed to forcefully strip the opponent of their carefully constructed and fragile armor. Notice the posture of the predator, leaning back into the heavy shadows, deliberately creating physical distance to establish an unshakable foundation of absolute psychological dominance. They do not lean forward aggressively. Leaning forward is a desperate plea, an animalistic urge to physically close the gap and force their will upon you. Leaning back forces the prey forward. It generates a gravitational pull inward, forcing the weaker mind to stumble into the exact center of the trap. The black hole consumes all energy. Every frantic gesture from the prey is effortlessly absorbed and nullified entirely by the chilling density of the silence. The talker shrinks in physical size, crushed by the sheer atmospheric pressure, while the silent observer casually prepares to deliver the first microscopic psychological strike. Silence is not merely an absence of sound. It is a terrifying psychological vacuum that violently tears away at the human soul. This phenomenon is known as horror vacui, an ancient evolutionary glitch forcing the brain to desperately fill any empty space with meaning. When the prey speaks and receives no echo, their primitive survival instincts immediately interpret the deadly silence as a severe existential threat. Watch the eyes of the panicked victim. They dart wildly across the suffocating darkness, searching desperately for a single nod that validates their fragile existence in this room. But the darkness is absolutely ruthlessly flat. In normal conversation, people use verbal fillers, comfortable murmurs and agreements designed purely to lubricate the social friction between two minds. The master manipulator aggressively removes this lubrication, creating a brutal, grinding psychological friction, forcing the gears of the opponent's mind to violently spark and ultimately destroy their own logic. The prey's imagination becomes their worst enemy. Without feedback, their mind hallucinates the worst, projecting harsh judgment and brutal rejection onto the completely blank canvas of the predator's face. They are no longer negotiating with the observer. They are negotiating with their own deepest insecurities, a battle they have already lost before, uttering the very first desperate, breathless syllable. The silence is stretching out to eternity. 3 seconds have passed in pure agony, but to the terrified prey it feels like an absolute lifetime trapped in a suffocating coffin. The strategic 5-second pause is not passive. It is an extremely active and calculated psychological assault on the opponent's nervous system. When the prey finishes their desperate pitch, they expect the immediate comfort of a standard social response to ease their anxiety. Instead, the master manipulator offers absolutely nothing, letting the heavy dead air become a physical weight crushing down on the table. Second one brings only mild social confusion, a fleeting moment where the brain tries to process the sudden lack of input. Second two triggers the biological panic response. The amygdala screams that something is terribly wrong with the current social dominance hierarchy. Second three is where the structure crumbles. The prey's facial muscles twitch as they violently search for a way out of the void. Second four is pure, unadulterated mental torture, an agonizing stretch of time that violently rips away any remaining shred of confidence. And by the devastating fifth, brutal second, the over-explainer will inevitably break the silence, just to escape the suffocating psychological pressure. Look closely at the predator's unblinking eyes. They remain completely fixed and utterly devoid of any human empathy or basic mercy. Blinking is a sign of internal processing. Maintaining a fixed gaze projects an aura of absolute certainty and terrifying predatory focus. The stillness of the facial micromuscles creates an impenetrable wall of ice that freezes the opponent's chaotic energy completely dead. This is the exact moment of breaking. The precise second the psychological threshold is violently crossed without a single spoken word. The talker's jaw trembles under the weight. Their subconscious mind surrenders the alpha position to the unmoving black hole before them. They open their mouth to speak again, desperately offering unnecessary concessions just to buy a brief moment of relief from the silence. The 5 seconds of silence have worked. The weapon has successfully dismantled the target, leaving only a hollow shell of compliance. Watch the pathetic phenomenon of self-sabotage as the desperate prey begins to actively negotiate against their very own best interests. The predator hasn't spoken a single syllable, yet the victim is suddenly willing to surrender everything just to break the tension. They offer a lower price instantly, tearing down their own boundaries just to fill the agonizing void with human sound. This is the ultimate psychological vulnerability, a fragile ego collapsing inward, trying to construct a bridge over an endless chasm. Each new concession is a bloody sacrifice, thrown desperately onto the silent altar to appease a god that does not exist. The talker's hands flutter in erratic patterns, visually attempting to physically push away the invisible, suffocating weight of their own inadequacy. They apologize for things unsaid and undone, frantically shifting their physical posture in a pathetic display of total and utter submission. Observe the predator's calculated lack of movement. Not a single micro-expression is offered to reward or acknowledge this tragic self-inflicted destruction. By remaining entirely blank and completely still, the master manipulator forces the vulnerable target to essentially dig their own professional grave. Silence is a mirror reflecting internal terror, showing the prey exactly how weak and fundamentally insecure they truly are right now. They contradict their previous confident opening statements, backpedaling with a frantic energy trying to find any acceptable common ground that works. The verbal diarrhea becomes a weaponized confession, spilling out secrets they never intended to reveal in this high-stakes corporate power dynamic. The silent observer simply absorbs the data, cataloging every single strategic error made by the drowning man gasping for social oxygen. To win without firing a single shot is the highest pinnacle of tactical dominance ever achieved in the dark corporate theater. The self-sabotage is now entirely mathematically complete, leaving nothing but the scattered ashes of what was once a highly confident facade. True dominance is never displayed through grand, sweeping theatrical gestures that are meant to artificially intimidate the weak and desperate room. It bleeds out slowly through the microscopic, extremely subtle muscular contractions that barely even register on the conscious visual spectrum. We call these fleeting visual signals micro-expressions, a chilling window into the absolute terrifying confidence of the apex corporate predator. Notice the terrifying rhythm of their breathing. It is completely and entirely out of sync with the frantic panic surrounding them. A resting heart rate of 60 beats, while the desperate opponent is now literally suffocating in their own boiling biological adrenaline. The predator's fingers remain perfectly steepled together, quietly resting in a flawless geometric triangle that visually anchors their dark psychology. A single finger taps rhythmically against mahogany, quietly acting as a dark psychological metronome, dictating the exact pace of the execution. This slow tapping induces a hypnotic trance, forcefully demanding the prey to directly align their erratic heartbeat to the predator's tempo. Look closely at the corner of their mouth. A chilling microscopic smirk finally begins to slowly form within the heavy ink shadows. It is not a smile of genuine joy. It is merely the dark, sinister biological signature of a trap successfully snapping shut. The smirk acknowledges the opponent's complete submission, without ever actually having to audibly validate their pathetic existence with a single spoken word. Their eyes narrow by a millimeter fraction, deadly sharpening their focus much like a highly calibrated sniper rifle acquiring its target. Every single microscopic adjustment is heavily calculated, specifically designed to silently, subconsciously communicate an overwhelming and completely insurmountable disparity in power. The prey processes this subtle visual data, and their broken subconscious mind almost instantly waves the white flag of total cognitive defeat. The master manipulator has entirely conquered the space, utilizing absolutely nothing more than just a terrifyingly deliberate control over their own facial muscles. The psychological pressure finally reaches its absolute peak, breaking the structural integrity of the carefully constructed lies they told themselves. A human mind can only sustain a false reality for a limited time before the crushing gravity of the truth collapses it. Watch the physical manifestation of a complete lie shattering as the desperate talker begins to frantically stammer and lose all vocal control. The carefully rehearsed corporate pitch instantly dissolves into dust, leaving only the raw, pathetic, and terrifyingly vulnerable core of a broken person. They are no longer trying to win the negotiation. They are merely begging the unmoving darkness to grant them a swift execution. The truth bubbles up like a drowning man's final breath, bursting violently through the surface of their meticulously curated and heavily guarded facade. Every single hidden insecurity they tried to conceal is suddenly vomited onto the table, without a single ounce of logical restraint. They admit to the flaws in their own logic. They highlight the weaknesses of their original proposal just to keep on talking. This is the phenomenon of the unforced catastrophic error, a direct psychological consequence of the silent vacuum heavily pressing on their skull. The observer does not need to interrogate the suspect, because the terrifying weight of the silence acts as a brutal psychological truth serum. A single drop of sweat reaches the trembling jaw, confirming that the subject has entirely lost the capacity to regulate their emotions. The hands that once slammed the mahogany table are now weakly clutching their own chest, as if protecting a dying heart. The words pour out in a desperate, disjointed flood, completely washing away the last remaining shreds of their professional dignity and leverage. The silent predator remains absolutely anchored in the shadows, quietly watching the tragic spectacle unfold with the cold detachment of a machine. The trap has collected the ultimate prize of dominance, the absolute, unvarnished, and completely surrendered truth delivered voluntarily by a broken enemy. After the psychological demolition is entirely complete, the apex predator finally decides to deliver the final, crushing death blow. They do not need a grand speech, they only need a single syllable to completely seal this tragic victory. The heavy silence is suddenly pierced instantly by the deliberate movement of someone, taking absolute control of the room. Watch the predator slowly lean slightly forward, closing the physical gap just enough to establish their undisputed physical dominance. This tiny shift in physical mass forward acts like a heavy executioner's blade, falling sharply onto the wooden table. The broken prey immediately stops their rambling, staring with desperate, wide-open eyes, hoping for a tiny sliver of mercy. They hold their breath in agonizing suspense, waiting for the final heavy judgment to be delivered from the shadows. The master manipulator maintains the intense eye contact and delivers a slow, deliberate nod, confirming the absolute end of negotiations. Or perhaps they utter one single word, a quiet but incredibly heavy agreement that finalizes the total psychological takeover. That single syllable echoes through the darkness, sounding like the massive steel doors of a high-security prison closing. The talker exhales a massive sigh of relief, completely unaware that they just sacrificed their entire professional leverage and dignity. They mistake the predator's silence for wisdom and interpret the minimal, tiny response as a highly profound social validation. The trap has cleanly severed the artery, draining the opponent's leverage completely dry, without ever leaving a single fingerprint. The predator leans back into the dark, fading into the heavy ink shadows, leaving the broken victim completely alone. The space returns to its quiet state, but the balance of corporate power has been permanently and violently altered. The final truth of the corporate battlefield is that whoever speaks first to break the heavy tension has already lost. Society mistakenly rewards the loud and charismatic, but survival actually belongs exclusively to those who can weaponize the absolute void. The next time you enter a negotiation, do not rush to frantically fill the empty spaces with your own anxious noise. Plant your feet firmly on the ground and force the desperate opponent to navigate the terrifying depths of your absolute stillness. Let them exhaust their fragile mental reserves while you sit calmly and observe their inevitable psychological collapse from the dark shadows. True authority does not need to roar, it only needs to silently exist and let the gravity do all the work. A master understands that words are cheap, while silence is a highly expensive luxury that only the truly powerful can afford. When you strip away the loud distractions, what remains is the raw, terrifying truth. of human nature exposed on the table. The talker is a slave to validation, forever trapped in a desperate cycle to seek continuous approval from the unyielding void. But the observer is the true master, completely free from the pathetic biological urge to constantly justify their own physical existence. Remember this rule in the dark boardroom: the one who can endure the silence the longest will always hold the crown. Do not give them your valuable energy. Simply absorb their frantic panic and slowly turn it into your own undeniable leverage. The game of power is perfectly simple. The loudest voice in the crowded room is always the easiest target to break. Embrace the cold void of the unknown. Become the chilling black hole that silently devours all the light in the room. And when the agonizing silence finally settles, let them realize too late that they have completely destroyed themselves from the inside.